There's a photograph that exists somewhere in a sealed medical archive in rural Virginia. In it, you can see the silhouette of a woman standing in a doorway. She's young, maybe 19, maybe 20, and her belly is swollen beneath a cotton dress. But if you look closer, if you study the way her hands grip the doorframe, the hollow darkness behind her eyes, you realize something is terribly, terribly wrong. This photograph was never meant to be seen by the public. It was taken by a state health inspector in 1957, 3 days before the woman gave birth to something the attending physician would later describe in his private journal as an impossibility of nature. The child lived for 17 minutes. The mother never spoke again. And the family, scattered across 4 generations in a valley so isolated it didn't appear on most maps, had been hiding a secret that would eventually surface as the most extreme documented case of inbreeding in American medical history. What you're about to hear is not folklore. It's not an urban legend whispered around campfires. It's a true story, buried in hospital records, court documents, and the fading memories of people who were told to forget. This is the story of what happens when a bloodline closes in on itself, when isolation becomes inheritance, and when the consequences of silence become written in flesh and bone. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The valley had no official name. On county maps from the 1940s and 50s, it was marked simply as Hollow 9, a crease in the Appalachian foothills where 3 dirt roads converged and then stopped, as if the land itself had refused to let them continue. The families who lived there, maybe 60 people total, were known to outsiders only by a single surname, one that appeared on deeds dating back to the 1780s. They didn't leave the valley often. They didn't marry outsiders. And when state census workers came through every 10 years, they were met with silence, closed doors, and an unspoken understanding that some places preferred to be left alone. But isolation, as history has shown us again and again, is not protection. It's a slow-acting poison. By the early 1900s, the bloodlines in Hollow 9 had begun to tangle. First cousins married, then second cousins. Then, when the pool grew too shallow, the definitions blurred entirely. There were no churches to forbid it, no officials to enforce marriage laws, no outside voices to interrupt what had become over generations simply normal. The children born from these unions were often weak. Some had developmental delays. Others were born with physical deformities, cleft palates, fused fingers, spines that curved like question marks. But in a place where everyone shared blood, where everyone carried the same genetic load, these things were accepted as God's will, as bad luck, as the price of living the way their ancestors had lived. No one spoke of it. No one questioned it. Until 1956, when a girl named Evelyn became pregnant, and everything that had been hidden in the dark finally came into the light. Evelyn was 17 when the sickness started. At first, her mother thought it was something she'd eaten, spoiled meat maybe, or water from the creek that ran brown after the rains, but the nausea didn't stop. It came in waves, every morning, relentless and violent, until Evelyn could barely stand. Her skin took on a grayish pallor, her hands trembled, and when her aunt finally noticed the swelling beneath her dress, the entire family gathered in the main house to decide what to do. There was no doctor in the valley. There hadn't been one in decades. Births happened at home, attended by the older women who had learned from their mothers, who had learned from theirs. Death, too, was a private affair. But something about Evelyn's pregnancy felt different. The women whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. They touched her belly and pulled their hands back quickly, as if they'd felt something wrong beneath the skin. And when Evelyn asked who the father was, because even she, in her fog of confusion and shame, couldn't quite remember, the room fell silent. The truth, as it eventually came out, was worse than anyone wanted to admit. Evelyn's father and her mother were brother and sister, not half-siblings, not step-siblings, full blood. They had been raised in the same house, born to the same parents, and somewhere in the blurred morality of the Hollow, they had become more than family. Evelyn herself was the product of that union, and now, at 17, she was pregnant by her own father. The child growing inside her was the result of 2 generations of incest, a genetic spiral so tight that doctors would later say it was a miracle she had survived her own birth, let alone carried a pregnancy to term. But no one in the Hollow understood genetics. They understood only shame and survival and the unspoken rule that what happened in the valley stayed in the valley. The labor began on a February morning in 1957, while frost still clung to the windows and the valley sat wrapped in a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Evelyn had been in pain for 2 days. Not the rhythmic contractions the older women expected, but something constant and grinding, as if her body was rejecting what it carried. She screamed until her voice gave out. She clawed at the bedsheets until her fingernails split, and when the midwife, a distant cousin named Ruth who had delivered dozens of babies in the Hollow, finally saw the crown of the child's head, she stepped back from the bed and crossed herself. The baby was born just after dawn. It came out silent. No cry, no movement, just a small, twisted thing that didn't look like any child Ruth had ever seen. Its skull was misshapen, collapsed on one side as if the bones had never fully formed. The eyes were fused shut, sealed beneath a thin membrane of skin. One arm ended at the elbow in a smooth, fingerless bulb. The legs were bent backward at the knees, locked in a position that made it impossible to imagine the child ever standing. And the skin, pale, almost translucent, revealed a network of veins so dense and chaotic it looked like a roadmap to nowhere. Ruth wrapped the child in a blanket and placed it in a wooden basin by the fire. She didn't know what else to do. The baby's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular gasps. Its mouth opened and closed like it was trying to breathe through water. Evelyn, barely conscious, asked if it was a boy or a girl. Ruth couldn't answer. She wasn't sure the question even mattered. For 17 minutes the child lived. Then, as quietly as it had arrived, it stopped. No final breath, no shudder, just stillness. Ruth recorded the death in a small notebook she kept for such occasions, writing only, "Born dead, lived a moment, gone." She told the family the child had been stillborn. It was kinder that way, but someone else had been there that morning. A man named Dr. Howard Finch, a state health inspector who had been conducting rural surveys for the Virginia Department of Health. He had arrived in Hollow 9 the day before, clipboard in hand, asking questions about sanitation, disease rates, and infant mortality. The families had tried to turn him away, but Finch was persistent. He had a mandate from the state, and he wasn't leaving until he'd documented every household. When he heard the screams coming from the main house, he made his way inside. What he witnessed in that room would haunt him for the rest of his life. Finch was a trained physician. He had worked in field hospitals during the war, had seen injuries and illnesses that would break most men, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw in that basin by the fire. He examined the infant's body with shaking hands, taking measurements, making notes, photographing the deformities from every angle. He asked Ruth about the parents. She hesitated, then told him the truth, or as much of it as she knew. Evelyn's lineage, the father's identity, the generations of intermarriage that had led to this moment. Finch's face went white. He asked to see the family records, birth certificates, anything that could help him understand the scope of what had happened here. What he found was a genealogical nightmare. Over the course of 3 days, Finch interviewed 17 members of the family, mapping their relationships on a series of charts that grew more tangled and incomprehensible with each conversation. Parents who were also cousins, siblings who had children together, generations where the same names appeared over and over, looping back on themselves like a snake eating its own tail. The genetic coefficient, the measure of shared DNA between the infant's parents, was calculated at approximately 75%. To put that in perspective, identical twins share 100%, full siblings share 50%. This child had been born from a union so genetically close, it was the equivalent of a person reproducing with themselves. Finch knew he was standing at the center of something that would rewrite medical understanding of human inbreeding. He submitted his report to the Virginia State Health Department in March of 1957, a 43-page document that included photographs, genetic charts, and witness testimonies. He titled it simply, "Hereditary Consequences of Isolated Reproductive Populations." He recommended immediate intervention, genetic counseling, social services, potentially even legal action to prevent further intermarriage within the community. The report was filed, stamped, and buried. Within 2 weeks, Finch received a letter from his supervisor instructing him to cease all investigation into Hollow 9. No explanation was given. No follow-up was authorized. When Finch pressed the issue, he was quietly reassigned to a desk job in Richmond and told that some matters were better left to local discretion. The message was clear. This story was not to be told. For decades, the report sat in a locked cabinet in the state archives, accessible only to researchers with special clearance. Finch himself never spoke publicly about what he'd witnessed, though colleagues later said he kept the photographs in a manila envelope in his desk drawer and that he would sometimes take them out late at night and stare at them, as if trying to understand how nature could allow such a thing to exist. The families in Hollow 9 scattered after that winter. Some moved to neighboring counties. Others disappeared entirely, changing their names, cutting ties, burying their history beneath new identities. Evelyn was sent to a state psychiatric facility in 1958, diagnosed with catatonic schizophrenia. She never spoke again. Medical records indicate she spent 37 years in that institution, a ghost wandering the halls, until she died in 1995 of pneumonia. She was 55 years old. If you're still walking, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The story might have ended there, forgotten in the archives, erased from memory, if not for a graduate student named Patricia Hollis who stumbled across Finch's report in 2003 while researching Appalachian health records for her dissertation. She was studying patterns of genetic disease in isolated populations, and when she saw the coefficient numbers in Finch's data, she thought there had been a mistake. No human population, she believed, could sustain that level of inbreeding and produce live births. But the photographs didn't lie. Neither did the genealogical charts. Hollis spent the next 4 years tracking down surviving members of the family, piecing together what had happened in the decades after Finch's visit. What she discovered was that Hollow 9 had not been an anomaly. It had been a symptom. Across rural America, particularly in isolated mountain communities, similar patterns had emerged throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, places where geography, poverty, and cultural insularity had created genetic bottlenecks. Places where families had become so intertwined that the concept of outsider had lost all meaning. But none, according to the medical literature Hollis reviewed, had produced a case as extreme as Evelyn's child. The infant represented what geneticists call a terminal inbreeding event, a point where the human genome, compressed and duplicated beyond its tolerance, simply collapses. The child's 17 minutes of life were, in a sense, borrowed time. A biological impossibility sustained only by the stubbornness of a heartbeat that didn't yet know it had no future. Hollis published her findings in 2009 in the Journal of Genetic Medicine under the title Extreme Consanguinity and Developmental Catastrophe, a case study from rural Virginia. The paper was peer-reviewed, cited, and quietly controversial. Some academics praised her récit, which others questioned the ethics of exhuming such a painful history, and a few, descendants of the families involved, sent her letters asking her to stop, to let the dead stay buried, to leave the past alone. But the past never stays buried, not really. In 2018, a documentary filmmaker attempted to locate the exact site of Hollow 9 using old county maps and property records. What he found was nothing. The houses were gone. The roads had grown over. Even the cemetery, where Ruth's notebook indicated several infants had been buried without markers, had been reclaimed by the forest. It was as if the valley had swallowed itself, erasing every trace of the people who had lived there. Yet the story persists, whispered among medical ethicists, genetic researchers, and historians who specialize in the darker corners of American life. Because what happened in Hollow 9 wasn't just about one family, one child, one tragic birth. It was about what happens when isolation becomes inheritance, when silence becomes complicity, when the things we refuse to name are allowed to reproduce in the dark until they become monstrous. Dr. Finch died in 1989 at the age of 76. In his personal effects, his daughter found a letter he had written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular. In it he described the morning he watched that infant die. He wrote about the way its tiny hand had opened and closed, grasping at air, at nothing, at a life it would never have. He wrote that he had spent 30 years trying to forget that moment, and 30 years failing. And he ended the letter with a single question. Who was responsible? The parents who didn't know better, the community that had normalized the abnormal, the state that turned away, or all of us for pretending that some places are too far away, too forgotten, too uncomfortable to care about? That question has never been answered. The infant was never named. It was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the hills of Virginia, and the only record of its existence is a 17-minute gap between birth and death in a state medic. Old file that most people will never see. But it existed, it lived, and in those 17 minutes it bore witness to a truth we don't like to acknowledge, that the human body can be twisted, broken, and deformed by the choices of those who came before. That bloodlines carry memory. That some sins are written into the DNA itself, passed down like heirlooms until the weight of them becomes too much to bear. And that sometimes the most horrifying stories in history are the ones no one wanted to tell. If you made it this far, you've done something most people won't. You've looked directly at a piece of history the world tried to erase. Leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs to know that the past is never as dead as we pretend it is. And remember, there are thousands of stories like this one, still buried, still waiting to be found. Some of them might be closer to home than you think.